Beautiful.
Perfect.
Elizabeth, welcome to the Calm Mom podcast. I'm beyond excited to have you here. For all you guys listening, we were just like starting and having this beautiful conversation. And then both of us were like, we should hit record so other people can hear this. So I want to jump back into it, but I also want you to introduce yourself to our audience and just let them know a little bit about your story. Myself too. I want to hear more about your story. And then we'll kind of jump in.
Sounds great, Michelle. It is such an honor to be here talking with you. I've just loved listening to your podcast. We were speaking earlier about the souvenirs of my binge listen to it yesterday on a very long walk. And it's just so important what you do and the subjects you go into and put front and center. So thank you.
Mm.
And so my name is Elizabeth, and I have spent exactly half of my life teaching adults writing. And something happens, I think, in reaching that half of life point
Wow.
where I've been teaching writing longer than I've been doing anything else, longer than I've been parenting, longer than I've been publishing books.
Wow.
And so a lot of what I think we'll probably talk about today with editing comes from thinking about the questions that come up when adults come to with their own set of sometimes very specific agendas and sometimes very open-ended. I'm looking for something, but I don't know what.
Yeah.
Questions that bring them to want to learn writing. So this idea of editing feels like something that we do to do to their pages, but also do with an eye for what brings each of us to learn something new and to
Mm.
make a life change. And we were speaking before we started recording about making enormous life changes, of the sea change variety, and what has caused us to edit our life in that way, and what we're hoping will happen, or open to happening. So,
Yeah.
teaching writing has been at the center of my life for a long time. I also have two small children who are, I say small, and I've been saying small, but they're actually, one is a teenager, so they're not so small. And I'm keenly aware of all of those moments, and you probably remember, I think all parents have them when you're so deep in the trench of whatever age you're in. I
Yeah.
remember sitting with my firstborn daughter when she was 6 months old, and hanging out with, I think, a 1.5-year-old who just felt impossibly old. And
Mhm.
the mother of the 1.5-year-old was saying things sort of to me, implying that I was in the mother camp with her. But all I could think is, we're in such different camps, because like I can't even imagine what it's like to have a kid as old as yours. Like what a like wow. Like
Yeah.
your kid can, I don't know, food in its own mouth. Like what an amazing. So it's really funny being in the trenches of 13 and a half and 10, while also remembering how recent were each of the other trenches.
Yeah.
But this is a really fun autonomous trench,
Mm.
and I'm enjoying its challenges, even if they remain challenges. And when I'm not teaching or with my children, I'm writing. And writing has been, to use the Gary Keller phrase, my one thing for as long as I can remember, by which I mean the one thing that makes the rest of my life better and brighter. And the thing that if I write most days, I feel better able to love the world full time.
Mm.
And I feel like a better parent. I feel like I'm more attuned to the beauty around me. I
Mm.
feel, you know, productive, patient, more likely to drink enough water and
Yeah.
exercise. All
Yeah.
of the things kind of I find stack up from the bottom nicely if writing is part of my day. So writing is a very big practice of mine, both something that has led to books, and I've got 13 of them, which feels amazing. So my writing and parenting journeys have pretty much
Wow.
lasted, have kind of grown up together in a way. I have always written for my own pleasure, but when my daughter was born, I thought maybe I should try to see what the next level of this is. So my publishing and parenting have always been together. And we talked before recording about adding chaos to chaos. And that was, when I
Yeah.
look in the early days, I think, wow, how? But of course, this is what every parent asks as you look back and you think, how? But you do
Yeah.
it. And you called it the selective amnesia. You just do it. You just wake up
Yeah.
and you do it. But it was, sort of, it is now something that feels, just like part of my life in a lovely way. But it's to the focus of editing. It's been fun to see my children at their current ages start to develop their own things that give them their
Mm.
own sort of energy, things that make their lives better. My daughter, a 13-and-a-half-year-old, is an artist through and through and is in her little office, which is her desk in the living room, um, sketching. Right now it's a book about fashion, sketching like fashion girls and clothes. And my son is interested in nature, and he's actually drawing also. I think he's painting rocks. So lots of art projects. And my husband's a swimmer, so his thing is being in the water. So it's neat sort of seeing this unit of, the culture of a family of four kind of evolve with its creative and with its needs
Yeah.
that shape the trajectory of the whole in some sort of surprising ways.
Wow, it's beautiful. I love this idea of the thing. And I also have a thing, and I think it's just so important for all of us to have a thing because I think, our purpose is so much bigger than any one role that we fill. And when we have this thing that we know when we do it, we just feel so alive. Like there's just something about doing that thing, and you're like, oh, this is what I was created to do. Like this just is
Yes.
it. And it's so encouraging and it's so motivating and it fires us up. And I don't want to say it breaks my heart, but so many of the women that I come across that I work with are desperately seeking a thing. And they
Yes.
haven't discovered their thing, or they don't even know where to begin because motherhood has been this all-consuming thing in and of itself, but it feels sometimes so confining, I think, to a lot of us. And
Yes.
I'm just so curious to hear, you knew your thing before you had children and you're doing your thing while raising children. And I would love to hear about that season where you became a mom and the impact it had on doing your thing, and then maybe how you had to fight to protect your thing.
Yes, that's a wonderful question. You ask such beautiful questions. I love this question. And I think that the fighting to protect the thing is a really important part of it. And when I
Yeah.
think about, and I want to come to that for sure, but I also want to speak to echo what you say about the importance of the thing. And I have observed that a lot of a lot of I've observed a lot of kind of sadness and frustration in many women when they hit empty nest and have had that. You may have had these conversations too, and have had incredible focus on this sort of the domestic world, and have done a great job of focusing, the sort of the full dazzle of their energy on this world,
Mhm.
and then often feel this like crack open emptiness afterward, and are missing the thing.
Yeah.
And I think about this a lot because so many of the women that I've learned to write from were themselves grandmothers and great grandmothers who chose writing as their thing. I feel like it almost doesn't matter. I mean, I don't think it matters at all what the thing is, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what the thing is. Like pick a thing, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But it does feel important to have a thing. And it
Yes.
feels, I think about this sort of, maybe there's even some fake it till you make it picking a thing,
Sure.
that's certainly like, I don't know, like again, writing, yeah, writing aside, like I think it's from the outside looking in, if we're looking at it from the kid's perspective, I certainly want to feel that I want to believe that my mom has a thing, besides her children, that is making her
Yeah.
happy right now. And I
Yeah.
and I know that for my children, I think even though there's sometimes where my writing, you competes with time that I would otherwise give to them, there's certainly times now that they're old enough that if I'm kind of lingering too long in a game that they're playing, they want me to go back to the thing. And there was one day that I remember when I really realized how old my kids had gotten. it was in August. So it was August is the time when I'm not teaching and when I've usually either wrapped a draft. Usually August is the month when I sort of time my schedule to be between teaching and writing things. So it's
Mhm.
kind of an exhale month. And I just finished sort of what felt like everything for the sort of year and the reset, and had been telling my kids, through July, like, I can't do this thing right now because I'm teaching or I'm writing. Just a moment, give me an
Yeah.
hour. And so I felt this sort of, the the boulder had rolled out from the cave, and I showed up and said, "Okay, I'm ready to join you in the game." And my son looked up from some, elaborate, huge, like Lego thing they were building together. And he said, "Oh, hi, Mom. We're in the middle of a project. Why don't you go back and do some grading? And we'll let you know when we're done." In other words, go find your thing. I love you. Go find your thing. Um, and we'll see you
Yeah.
soon. But it's so important to have those things, and to be able to, I think, navigate between, I often think of sort of the triangle base of my own kind of mental health is sort of, love. There's love on one point, of course, relationships. And then there's work, whatever work means. And then there's play. And I think,
Yes.
our thing, the writing for me sort of toggles between work and play, but I think I'm going to put it squarely in play because it is something that I would do voluntarily,
Yeah.
that that just feels good to do. But so back to the question again, rabbit trails. I think that writing for me started very young, as it started for both of my children, as I grew up in Texas and wrote lots of early poems about things that I didn't know much about, like snow. And and I also had spent a lot of time at my desk, at my very messy desk, planning out a novel that I never wrote about a class of students. I remember all their names: Leslie Langley and Susan Preston. I had all these characters whose interactions I'm sure mirrored the interactions of of my friends that I was trying to kind of make sense of.
Yeah.
But there was always this, I was always a reader, and writing was always this sort of fun thing to do, but not very systematically. And when it became systematic, it was in high school during what Catherine May would call a winter, which sort of a lonely period
Hmm.
of um, of having recently gotten dumped by my two best high school friends,
Oh.
who had recently gotten boyfriends. And so I sort of found myself in a lot of kind of solitude, and ended up just taking my journal and writing in cafes. So writing and reading were sort of this thing that I did in the absence of like a robust social life for, 6 or 7 months during a pretty lonely junior year in high school. And then they became, to use the words of our earlier conversation about sea changes, they became these very grounding things that I could and did do anywhere, that I really
Mhm.
enjoyed. And so when I look back on my life in college and in grad school and as a new mother, and now the continuity is I'm always sort of writing in cafes. And that's sort of the joke, is like, my husband will look back at his younger self and say, like, he did all these things that I would never do now, whereas I just was still writing in cafes,
Yeah.
drinking chai tea. Um, it hasn't changed much. Now I guess I get paid to do that, but so the writing was always there and always just felt good, and I think felt therapeutic from a pretty early age.
Mm.
And I think maybe related to that, felt like a way to process, to sort of cycle. And you used to talk about this in your beautiful 7 A's podcast, which I loved so
Mm.
much. Um, I think writing was a place where I could safely cycle feelings into wisdoms
Ah,
or kind of
yeah.
actions that I could sort of feel frustrated about a given thing and write it to the point to see, oh, here is where I'm stuck, or
Wow.
here is what I should have said and should say again if the situation arises, or here's what I might do to get out of this problem. So it just became this place it was a processing ground. And
Yeah.
I don't even know whose quote it is, probably many people's quote, that a writer writes to figure out what they have to say. I think that's something that I see again and again in my students' work. And so I think for that reason, the process of sort of milling wisdom from feelings has always felt like the most important thing. And so because of that, my writing journey has been all over the map, from
Wow.
biography to poetry to children's books to novels to, oh my gosh, memoir, to all sorts of things, just depending on what feels kind of like the right container to ask and answer this particular life question.
Yeah, wow. That's really beautiful because your thing became like a carved out space to reflect and to process. And
Yes.
I think that's missing for a lot of us. And
Isn't that a
just in
wise
the
point?
pace. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's so important. And I think we underestimate um how much our brain is actually designed to do that and how important it is for our brain. And I kind of want to get into this idea of editing because I was telling you before we hit record, I listened to her TEDx talk this morning, laying in bed next to my daughters on like the quietest it could be with me, still hearing it. And I'm gonna link it in the show notes because I want you guys all to hear it. And I would love for you to share, Elisabeth, a little bit about um, that story and that awakening that you had that you could edit your life like you had edited so much of your writing. Because I know there are so many women listening who are seeking a simplicity that feels out of reach. They're seeking an alignment that feels confusing. And to hear you talk about editing your life, I was like, oh, that makes so much sense to me. And I like ran downstairs and I told my husband about it. I'm like, she's talking about she starts with all this like 4 pages of work, and then you have to be so selective and discerning and just choose what matters most. And then once you've like kind of parsed it all down, it's like, oh, this is the magic I was looking for. And I want you to tell us a little bit about that and the story behind it, because I think it's going to really touch a lot of women.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to it. And I love that you listen to it in bed with your daughters. That is so cozy. That's so cozy. And I love that you bring it up in the wake of this idea of creating space for ourselves as mothers. I think that is huge. And I've often thought that that is one of the benefits of having. I love that the word we've settled on is the thing. It's like
Yeah.
it's like the word like stop. You're like, I'm sure there's a better word for this, but having the thing that you love to do is that
Yeah.
I've as it's hard for us as mothers, as women, when there's sort of more to do than we could possibly do, even if we're doing everything we can do. It's
Mm.
hard to feel justified in asking for space for ourselves, which is something I know you've touched on a lot, and it's
Yeah.
so important.
Yep.
And I think that one reason why I remain endlessly grateful to writing is that some days it really just, especially when my babies were tiny, it felt like it was my card to exchange for solitude. I know that sounds terrible because we should
Mhm.
all have the right to solitude, but
Yes.
I didn't always know how to gracefully ask for it.
Yeah.
And I think that none of us are taught to do that, which is something we should certainly teach our children, is
Yes.
how to gracefully say, I need some solo.
Yep.
And so I think it's nice to say, I'm going to go work on this thing because that's a nameable quantity that people
Yeah.
will, people will sort of accept a closed door for.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important that you bring this up because whatever the thing is, anyone should have the right to a closed door, and that's a wonderful thing to,
Yeah.
it sort of overturns I'm thinking of the Virginia Woolf room of her own idea. And I'm also thinking about this sort of age-old punishment of go to your room. And I love the sort of positive discipline idea that like we should all go to our rooms when we need a
Yeah.
little quiet. Like that should be a pleasure for us all. Like
Yes.
we're all a little overheated. Why don't we all just go to our rooms and have a lovely time and come back in an hour? Like all of these scripts can, I think, be rewritten with an eye for the loveliness of solitude. But you're
Yeah.
right, it's not sort of part of our dominant narrative, and it's not something that I think a lot of people sort of grow up comfortable with.
Yeah.
So I think that's a wonderful way to enter into editing by thinking of it as an act, a verb that creates space. I think let's start with that it's a verb that creates space around the essential thing. And I think with
Hmm.
that definition, we can do a lot
Yeah.
because um, I think a mistake about editing in writing or life is that it's about throwing everything away and standing in an empty day or an empty life or an empty room and saying, ta-da! But it's right, like there's no such thing at
Hmm.
the end of the day. We all make food, we make laundry, we spend time, we
Yeah.
speak, like it will never be empty.
Yeah.
But we can ask, what is the essential thing, and has it gotten lost in all the chaos? And I'm inspired by you know, what we were talking about earlier with, your family's big recent change, that it feels like um, asking that question of what is the most, important thing. Like, what do I want to look back on my life and remember,
Mhm.
can often be very clarifying when we realize that we've gone many, many, many days without that thing being
Yeah.
part of our
Yeah.
lives, and for
Yeah.
me, it's always, feeling connected to my people, and writing. And that's kind of it. I'm sure I should probably have some hobbies. But like, those are the things that I just think, if those are the North Stars. So in terms of our editing story, the the trajectory of our life as young parents, I think, like many young parents, went from being in the simplicity of, a new relationship where your biggest question is like, how do we, what should we have for dinner? And like,
Yeah.
who do we hang out with? And how do we deal with like housework and the bills? These sort of questions that are about setting up shop and kind of setting up house together. And then all of a sudden you have a baby, and, you know, the house is sort of exploding at the seams because there's,
Mhm.
so much noise and so many objects and so many needs, and,
Yeah.
especially new babies, so demanding. And I think that's often the era of life for our generation, when um young parent, as opposed to, I think, other times when people would have maybe had a child and had more access to grandparents
Yeah.
or more sort of community support. I think we today tend to have babies when we're also at the most ferocious rising point, of our careers,
Yes.
trying to
Yeah.
get the airplane in the air, which is a lot harder than just steering it once it's in the air. So we're
Yes.
trying to do this launch professionally. We're in the hardest part of parenting, when, this child needs, 3-hour rounds of food and sleep. That's also the time when I think we're most likely to get puppies. I don't know if that's sort of your
Uh-huh.
experience, but that's like everyone, that you get in a relationship, you're like, let's just get a puppy. So you sort of have so much going on, that is like pretty extremely complicated and chaotic and wonderful, but it's just so much. And so we were feeling this, and as a response to the sort of overwhelm, that sort of confetti of time and activity, our journey really centered around this question of, I'm thinking of it both now in terms um, of Goldilocks, this sort of home too small, too big, just right.
Yeah.
Um, and also I'm thinking of how my husband and I are both cancers. So like, home is, we love home. But I feel our question really had home at the center of it, because it felt like that was important to sort of find the right container for the culture that we were creating as a family. And
Mhm.
so, like, I think many couples in that mode, we very quickly outgrew our first home, which was a
Mhm.
little 2 bedroom, 1 bath, the baby sleeping in the hall. And so we tried to extend a little longer there by building a tiny office for me in the backyard that would serve as mother-in-law for, grandparents who lived mostly in Texas and some in California, and also just be a place where I could hold writing workshops and do my writing, and where either parent could go when we just needed like a quiet nap. So it just became
Mhm.
this sort of lovely other place where we could be at home, but not at home.
Mhm.
But then eventually, still, we needed more space, and we were ready to have another child. So we ended up moving into a very big house, which again is the trajectory of life in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. That
Yeah.
you need more stuff, you need more space, you need more rooms,
Yeah.
and it was wonderful in a lot of ways. And also, that was the time when I really started feeling that the scaffoldings and containers we had built and created and bought to support the primary goals of our lives, which was to, do meaningful work, honor the thing, whatever that was for my husband and for me, do meaningful work, and enjoy being part of our family. Those were the two things. It felt like those were getting kind of washed over by all of the demands that of the house. And it was a strange shift, because I often think in writing, one of the conversations my students and I often have is how how problems are place specific. Like you might have a
Mm,
problem in North Carolina that wouldn't be a problem in California, that wouldn't be a problem in Denmark, that wouldn't be a problem in Japan, that, likewise, certain challenges exist in a certain house that go away in another house,
yeah,
but other problems might come up.
sure.
And in the bigger house, we had enough space, which was great to have our own offices, and the baby was not sleeping in the hallway. Like that was lovely. But also we found that there were, tremendous pressures of just sort of the managing a big house, all the things that I think any
Yeah.
parent would recognize, that it felt like there were so many things that were everywhere, and there were so many places for the dog to throw up. And there was so much money every month kind of leaking for things that needed to be fixed or repaired or replaced. It just felt like we were swimming in this sort of enormous space, which was lovely and which was what we had wanted.
Hmm.
But it I felt every day that I was failing to tend to the things that mattered most,
Yeah.
and failing to sort of be a decent, housekeeper and like person who could sort of manage, sort of the sort of basics of it. And it felt like the sort of Yeats poem, like the world is too much for us. Like it felt like the kind of house is too much for us.
Yeah.
And all the while we had kept little our little house we'd been renting out our house before that, and usually had a young couple without children living in my tiny office, which we call the shed. So it was a place that was a complete house with a bathroom and a kitchen. And we had often joked about, wouldn't it be nice if we, whenever the house felt particularly overwhelming or the roof would need to be replaced, we'd think like, oh, what if we just moved it to the shed? But that was not sort of a realistic thing. And then, the way that anything, and you know this from your own sea changes, like the way that anything when it's talked about enough becomes kind of normalized. It's like when you're interested in a new idea and you read one book, you're like, well, that's a crazy idea. But then you read six more books about it and you feel like, well, that's kind of
Wait a minute.
mainstream. you know, like we had, right? You're like, oh, well, that's some people actually do that. It felt a little
Mhm.
bit like that the earliest conversations felt very much like that would be an extreme thing to do. But then the more it came up, it felt like, well, people have lived in smaller houses before, and this has hot water and beds, and well, why not? So quite quickly, we got organized, not that quickly, but within, I don't know, I guess about 6 months of making the decision, we cleaned up the house and moved to the shed, which had a little Murphy bunk bed for the kids, and one table that was art table, dining table, desk. It was always funny when my husband would give the tour of the shed, because he would stand in the main, it was sort of one room with a loft and a tiny little kids add-on, and he would turn from to one side and say, this is the guest room, this is the living room, this is the kitchen, this is the study, just left to right, because everything was everything. And it felt from the first day so just feet on the floor grounding. Just here's
Wow.
everything we need in a very small, complete space. And I think that one of the things that felt like an early relief is how much could not fit in there.
Yeah.
And one of the things that couldn't fit in there, which was a beautiful surprise, was arguments about toys. Because in the right,
Every parent's like,
right,
amen.
I mean, we're parents, we totally get that. I mean, I just remember, yeah, and you couldn't, I mean, afternoons arguing over whose Lego this is. In moving into a house that small, the kids were given each a bin for their toys and figured out, let's combine our toys so we can share them all. And that was that. You just sort of you couldn't argue that. Similarly, like so many of us, by the time we have children, we've lived so many lives. Like I had suits from when I worked in a law firm, and I had belly dancing costumes from when I thought I would try that. I mean, you have so many things, and each one, each one of those, sort of is in a way the costuming for a thing, right? Like a thing that was going to be a major part of your life that got discarded along the way.
Mhm.
But you still have in your attic like bins and bins of costumes for things. And it was so refreshing that none of those could fit in the shed, that it had enough for us each to have, one life as we were
Yeah.
now,
Wow.
and let that life evolve together over the
Yeah.
seasons. We would need to bring in, winter coats, and then the kids would outgrow them. But we just sort of could only exist in the shed as we were now. And that also, I think, to the point of solitude, translated very beautifully to kind of emotional states. That if you're in such a small space and you can't just retire to the wing, to the
Mm.
far off wing and say, talk to you guys later, like you're bugging me. Like your mood shows all over your face. So if you need something, like you have to kind of tell your family pretty quickly, like I
Wow.
need, I need to not be the only person who cleans up after dinner. Like I can't,
Yeah.
there's no room for me to be sullen about this because like it takes up the whole one room space. So it just felt like emotions had, kind of, we had to be a little more, we had to kind of learn some communication skills that again, never would be perfect and never will be perfect, but just had to at least be on the table in order
Wow.
to figure out how to negotiate space. We had a whole like bathroom triage because we had a 3-year-old for like who went first and in what circumstances, like number one before number two. Like there were just a whole lot of things that were talked about. And similarly, the kids were, I think it felt like, they're obviously, they had a bedtime, and it was lovely that my husband and I could go to the loft and have time without the children.
Mm.
But also most conversations, I mean, I can't really think of very many exceptions that were going on in the house. The kids at least kind of overheard the way that your kids sort of overheard the talk in bed. Like, so it felt that there was this sense that felt very kind of ancient, that we were
Mhm.
all in this small dwelling, and
Wow.
the little pieces of adult conversation that one day will be, part of your lives
Yeah.
as adults who will become. Like you're seeing how the adults you love and trust most are sorting through these interesting challenges. And,
Yeah.
and I think that's, I loved the fact that I don't know. I felt on their behalf, and it'll be interesting what they say of it when they're grown-ups, that there was something like reassuring and like feet on the
Yes.
wooden floor, that there were not secrets from them that were going to jump up from the floorboards, that the things that were going to shape their lives, if they cared to listen, which most of the time they didn't because they had a Lego project, were there being worked out, you know, in the
Wow.
best way we could. So
Beautiful.
I think there are so many lovely things that came with that. And even though now they're older and we've shifted to a slightly bigger dwelling again, not as big as the first, but each of them has their own bedroom now, even though they have to share when we have a guest. I feel a lot of the same principles. I feel that those principles are such portable principles that it's sort of come as you are to your life now. And have, I think, a lot of, you know, think about space is a desirable thing, both, mental space and time space, not to mention sort of physical space of, asking hard questions. Like in the shed, you can't buy things, you have to just
Yeah.
replace things. So, if somebody, needed, if the garlic press broke, we needed another one, but we sort of didn't have room for 3 garlic presses, tiny details
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
We had like a little space on the sort of top, what is it, like a little place above the front door that was our sort of giveaway. Like when the kids would outgrow things, they would say like, okay, I need new underwear, and bring, their old ones, and that would be in the giveaway. Or like, I'm ready to swap out my toys, because we had their toy bin in the garage. So it felt like there was sort of a little, there was always an exchange.
Mhm.
Um, but it felt like there was just, there was not a corner, that sort of haunted feeling that when you sort of look in a room that never is used,
Yeah.
or when you open a drawer and you're like, what is in here?
Yeah.
Like there just wasn't room for that. And so I felt that felt like a really lovely model for all of life, to ask of any activity or any relationship or anything really that was sort of taking up mental or physical space in our lives, asking, what are you doing here? Are you here by choice?
Mhm.
And so I think the sort of um, yeah, I just think that the sort of takeaways keep coming as sort of gifts that in each era, in each season, kind of have new use and have new wisdom. But I do think I've noticed so much in my writing students that um, putting, editing in one area, deciding that running is important. My students who are training for like a running race often have an easier time finishing a novel, because you sort of,
Mhm.
the act of putting something here
Yeah.
it's the same act, right? It doesn't
Yeah.
matter what the thing is. I've noticed that similarly to what you and I were talking about earlier, that often my students who homeschool their children are the most prolific writers. And
Wow.
in terms of sheer time dynamics, you would think
Yeah.
that's impossible. Like how
Yeah.
in the world, they have a 3-year-old who's at home all the time. Like
Yeah.
when do they write? But they've, edited so that they have I don't know how, but the idea of sort of thinking here's how the day goes, and here's where we have time for, presumably quiet work, quiet art. Here's my school, here's your school. Like there's a framework
Yeah.
that leaves space for the things that are important, that then makes sure that nothing is in one's life that isn't important. It feels like the sort of editing begets editing
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah. And it's also this idea of like how we do one thing is how we do everything. Right. And it's
Yes.
almost, yeah. Well, I am obsessed with your story and I love this idea. And I think there's an invitation, for all of us listening to just kind of look at the things we've taken for granted or been resigned to with fresh eyes and reevaluate them. And for those of you who have been listening to the podcast, at least since the beginning of the year, because I talk about it a lot, you've probably heard me talk about Jeff and I, my husband, we always choose a word of the year. And this year, the word I chose was rest, and the word that Jeff chose was freedom. And it's so fascinating because in the journey that we've lived in the last, 8 months, we've come to realize that we actually chose the same thing and how much freedom there is in rest and that you can't have rest without freedom. And I think in this idea of editing, I think I don't know if it's probably all the things, but societal or just human nature. We think that we need all of these things to feel free, or we need all of these things to feel like we can finally rest. And it couldn't be farther from the truth. It's more of an act of unbecoming instead of becoming, right? It's like releasing all of these things. It's purging all of these things. And in this season, and I want to get your take on this. I've always, not always, but especially since having children, I've made it a priority to get really clear on the things that I value, right? Like I'm going to have a marriage that's on mission. I'm going to be a deeply present parent. I'm going to kind of buck the culture and push back against the things that I don't want to invade because I'm seeing it create, you know, a generation of anxiety and burnout and all of these things that I fight so hard against. And, um, you look at my calendar a year ago and those priorities just weren't reflected. Like they just weren't. And I just felt this like inner call to be like, are you going to have the guts to do something about that? And that's what I hear in your story is just having the guts to like overlap your values with how you're actually spending your time. And when you ended your TEDx talk, you talked about the two questions about, and I would just love for you to share about that because I think that's a really practical place for women to start is like ask yourself these two questions and then just see where that leads. Like you don't have to do what I just did and turn your world upside down, but you could probably do a little part in your morning routine or a mindset shift about something or like you said, give away some of the old toys before we bring new ones in. It can start so small, but it's so good for our soul.
Yes, it's so good for our soul. I love what you say about the word of the year, and I love that they are the same. That's so wise. That is so wise. The fewer things we require, the freer we are, and the more
Yeah.
we can rest from the relentless race to acquire them,
Yeah.
whatever they are. It's so wise. Um, and that's a beautiful setup to the two questions. And I agree. I think the two questions are a beautiful, simple start. And they are, what do you love?
Mm.
And what fills your day?
Hmm.
And how can those come closer to each other? And as you say, it takes a lot of guts
Yeah.
because it's easy to want to look away from, I think, that gap, because there's always going to be a gap. No
Yeah.
day is a perfect day.
Right.
No, those things that we love are going to change. The things that fill our day will change. Like everything will always change. But that's a pretty good perennial question.
Yeah.
And I think that by asking it, as often as we need to, it becomes harder to turn away. It becomes a habit to, right, to
Can't
lean into,
unsee it.
right? You can't unsee it. because it's, the wisdom has been offered to you by what you found through that looking. And and it's amazing how, um, as you say, changes can be big or small, and you made a huge change,
Mhm.
and we made not as big a change, but a big change too. Whereas when I've seen people ask these questions, I've been so awed by
Mm.
how creative the changes are that aren't necessarily ones that are visible to anyone except for the people living them. One woman, who was a wonderful, who, oh my gosh, who helped me launch the Edit Your Life book and helped me like turn it into a class. When she was asking herself that question, she runs a business, three businesses with, I think, something like 19 employees,
Oh,
and she got rid of her smartphone when
wow.
she, except for using it. She had a few specific ways she used it, like for the maps, but she decided to get a dumb phone for use at home so that she could not be getting 1,000 messages every time she sat down for
So
lunch. And she
smart.
said the first, so smart. And it was such a small change, but she made it, she sort of drew a fierce line and identified that what she wanted, and I think your husband's words are pretty much, sum it up. She wanted rest.
Hmm.
She wanted freedom and she wanted rest. And for her, that meant time with her horses, time listening to the birds, time in nature, and time with her sons.
Hmm.
And that simple change of having a phone that didn't have email on it meant that she could, in between times in her office, 3 times a day, she could sit down and feel restful and free. And it was so
Hmm.
small, so small.
Yeah.
But I think of that with, anything. It can be so small. It can be as small as saying, I think about this with writers, is telling our child for the next 5 minutes, I'm going to sit at the table and write a poem. Would you sit at the table and do something else for 5 minutes? Oh, it's been 4 minutes. It can be so small, just this tiny claiming of a space around something meaningful to us. But it is so empowering to think um, that there can be spaciousness around what matters.
Yeah. Amen. And carving out that time, like we were talking before we hit record too, about just the wisdom that you've gained from so many of these people you've talked about that have lived 9, 10 decades. Like it's wild. Um, and I just imagine as they're sharing with you some of their favorite memories and the moments that have had such an impact and that they still reflect on, it probably comes in those 5 minute pockets, right? It's not the hustle. It's not, when the business expanded, it wasn't the new house. It was like the making the cookies at 2 p.m. instead of, like the,
Yes,
and
small.
and if we're not careful, like I feel myself getting emotional about it because it's so easy to just dismiss a day
So
or a
easy.
moment, right? And it's like, well, I'll do that tomorrow, or things will slow down in this next season once the school year ends or something. And then, we probably get to a point where it's like, no, life was a collection of those Tuesdays, and like
Yes.
I'm so grateful that I caught the revelation at 38 and
Yes.
not 98. That now is the time that this is it.
Yes. This is it. Life is a collection of those Tuesdays. What a beautiful thing to say. It is, isn't it? The sort of the days that we were racing through to get somewhere else, the days that didn't feel like the the calendar days with everything on them. But life is a
Yeah.
collection of those Tuesdays. That is so wise. And there's a wonderful Annie Dillard quote that says something like, a day spent reading is not what anyone would call an exciting day, but a
Mm.
life spent reading is a good life.
Yeah.
And I think that's the way for everything, right? Like a day of, hanging around at the park, pushing a child on the swing. It's like, when you look back on it, that was like it's a lovely day in a lovely era, even if at the moment there are like 1,000 other things, pulling at
Yes.
the mind, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Whatever the thing is.
Not to like open a whole new can of worms.
I love the
but
cans of worms.
the episode, as we're recording this in real time, the episode that released yesterday on the podcast was about reevaluating like our relationship with productivity. And is it healthy or is it toxic? And I looked at 5 different ways, but a big part of that is even just defining for ourselves, what does productivity look like? And I had to really do that because, I came from a background as a defense attorney where my time was billed in 6-minute increments. And
Wow.
that became my
Wow.
benchmark for productivity. And now it's like, no, like wow, the most productive thing I can do right now is, you know, grab a blanket and snuggle my kids on the couch and read to them. Or the most productive thing I can do today is like, whatever it is that the world would tell me is not
Yes.
productive, and checking things off my list and getting
Yes.
stuff done. But we get to choose.
We get to, this is so wise. And I'm still like, I can't even, I'm just thinking about the 6 minutes. And I've worked at law firms and I've done from a research assistant point, 6 minutes is a crazy responsibility to
Yeah.
feel that one needs to be perfect for and one needs to like make count.
Yeah.
I'm thinking back to what you said about like making cookies and snuggling under a blanket. That can be a 2 hour affair with, right? But
Yes,
it's really, I think that's a really big challenge for a
it
lot
is. Oh, yeah.
of mothers who, you know, because most of us have spent more time in productive environments needing to get things done than we have in the sort of quiet, repetitive, what I think of as like 3 hour rounds of having a baby. Like I felt
Yeah.
nothing prepared me for that, whereas
Yeah.
like
No.
everything prepared me to work. And I'm still, I think, kind of reeling. Like I don't like, I mean, when I think about that, I don't know. Yeah, I'm still sort of
Yeah.
processing
And
like,
what's so fascinating is like, don't get me wrong, I still get stuff done, right?
yes,
But the
totally.
reason we can do both, and this is like taking it full circle, is because I've gotten so much better at editing.
Isn't that wise? And isn't that true? And the sort of figuring out what are the things that we wish to remember. What does
Yeah.
our, 90-year-old self, the idea of, and my husband has a phrase when he's swimming and someone says, "What are you training for?" He says, "I'm training for my 90s." And I think in a way by editing, we're kind of training for our 80s and 90s of, what do we want to remember? And before, again, so many good things before we press record. One of the things you asked me to bring up is the minimalist day plan that I love productivity too, and I'm excited to listen to your episode about it. And I can get sort of a little obsessive about it and have to take myself down. But what I've been doing for quite a long time are what I'm holding up is a tiny slip of paper that has 5 items on it and lots of brightly colored,
Brilliant.
messy scribble. And the 5 items are book task, work task, body, fun, and love. And a productive day is to do something meaningful in each of those categories. And my work task today was to go over your 6 questions to make sure that, which I think none of which we've answered actually, because we talked about other things, but to, prepare to meet with you. And my body task was like a little bit of exercise and a walk. And, love was, I had a date with my husband and then, showed my children a video on violent communication because they were bickering with each other. These small things. None of them take longer than, 20 minutes, really.
Yeah.
But they're all so important and they're
Yes.
all nice to sort of see in the in the variety of how many different, of the sort of mandala of a balanced day and a
That's it.
balanced life, right? It's so small.
Do you have that like on a sheet of paper that you've printed and then
I'll
you
send it
cut it
to you.
out?
I'll send it to you. It's
Would
so
you send
dorky.
it to me?
Of course I
I'm
will. It's
gonna
my
link
limited
it for you
skills of
guys.
design. It's like made on Microsoft Word. It's kind of ridiculous, but I will send it to you and you can probably make it pretty and more usable for the moms listening.
No, I think it's perfect as it is. And I just we were kind of alluding to it, and I know it's been on your heart, but for you guys listening, like that's self-care. That's it. Don't overthink it. Don't spend a ton of money. Don't get so overwhelmed by having to plan something that, you get to 8 p.m. and you're just too tired to do anything. Like it's 5 little check boxes that she has to care for herself in 5 different ways and move the needle forward and fill her, proverbial cup and all of these things. I love the flexibility in it, but then I love the structure in it, and I think that's brilliant.
Thank you. I agree. It's so important to have both. And this is so dorky. They're all so dorky. In my writing classes, we talk about dorky tools as being like these necessary things. But that is it. It's this mix of, these small things done with love that are both flexible and move forward. Because I
Yeah,
think those two are so necessary
yeah,
for all humans, all ages,
that's right.
um, and especially these sort of hinge eras when, we are raising the young and, with an eye to who we will become when they are raised. It's such an
Yes.
interesting, like such a short, and thinking of it from the point of view of sort of a long life, which we all hope we'll have,
Yeah.
it's such a small juncture. And this is something that I wish I had sort of, I'm sure older parents told me this, but I just probably didn't have the capacity to hear it. I'm amazed now, standing with a 10 and a 13-year-old, how short the era of very young children is. Because when I think about, when we think about becoming mothers, and when we sort of think about the eras when we're really kind of having trouble getting our head above water, most of
Mhm.
us, would you say it's like 1 to 4? It's like a very
Mhm.
short era
Yeah.
before they're kind of autonomous. It's so like probably right now already your daughters are
Yes.
like, I got this, mom. Like, I don't need you
Yes.
to get this, right? So it's
Yeah.
this tiny era of overwhelm.
Hmm.
Like I don't know if there's any recipe for getting unoverwhelmed,
Right.
when so much is demanded of us, but it's such a, I think it's the sort of good old like what to do when we have a problem. Make a change or change perspective. And I think that
Mhm.
that perspective really helps me think that each one of these life eras is so small, but that, yeah, flexible and a little structured seems like
Yeah. I
a nice
think
little
about it
approach.
like a palm tree because I just moved here from Miami. But it's a palm tree, right? Like it's built for flexibility for all those hurricane winds that come through and it can sway. But the reason it stays standing is because it's so rooted and it's both. It's like the foundation and the structure and the flexibility at the same time. It's the tension there is so beautiful.
I love that.
Hmm.
Yes, big sturdy roots in the ground and just going with it.
Yeah. Yep.
Going with it.
Man, this has been such a blessing for me. I've so enjoyed our time together. I feel
Me
like
too.
I need more Elizabeth in my life. I feel
I need
like
more Michelle in my life. What a
everyone needs
gift.
more Elizabeth in their life.
What a gift.
Tell
Thank you for
us
this
where
hour.
people can just get more of you. I'm gonna link all of the things, but especially for the people who just feel so called one to edit. I think we probably all do. And I think there's probably a lot of women, and I'll just say this, I work with a lot of women that I coach, and part of their expansion is re-exploring creativity. Um, because we've become so disconnected from that, I think, just caught up in the busyness. And I love that that's something that you're passionate about and offering to women. So tell us a little bit about where people can connect with you and continue to learn from you.
Oh, thank you. Creativity is so important. And I think, like self-care, it's a phrase that I think we're wise to sort of take off its pedestal a little
Yeah.
bit. And I think sometimes when we think of self-care, we think like very expensive massages, which like that's great too. But also sometimes it's as simple as like a checklist for, and when we think about creativity, we think like the finished novel, but it can really actually just be like painting rocks is our current one. It could be anything. It could be like, doesn't need to
Yeah.
be anything. It
I've
could
I've
be
encouraged a client last week to just start wearing more colors.
wearing more colors. It's so small. Well, like growing a plant. Like you can
Yeah.
just be like, it's like nurturing anything
Yep.
in the direction of beauty, right? Like nurturing anything in the direction of beauty. It can be like making cookies, it can be anything. It can be like curating a beautiful, you know, a bowl of popcorn and a movie that you really want to watch with your kids. Like it's any sort of act of creating beauty. I think it can just be thought of so broadly. So so thank you. So I want to say thank you to your audience of listening moms. Thank you to you for what you do, and thank you to listening for listening. And where you can find more of me. I'm not on social media very often, but I'm sometimes on Instagram. But my website is elizabethsharpmcketta.com, and I usually keep that pretty updated. And the book that I think will be of most use to people with questions about editing is called Edit Your Life. And it sort of has its roots in the TED Talk as well as in my teaching. And then yeah, then I and for people who are interested in writing, I also offer a private workshop for book writers. And I just love to hear from people with, random questions about writing because I could talk about that all day, writing and editing. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for your time and your care and your questions.
Thanks for being with us. This has been so good. I'm leaving so encouraged.
Thank you. I know my cup is full from this. Thank you
Mm.
so much.